Welcome to Studio Visits with Silver Eye, where I get to talk in depth with some of the most interesting contemporary photographers working today. I'm David Oresick, the Executive Director of Silver Eye Center for Photography. You can visit us online anytime at silvereye.org to learn more about all of our programs, and you can find a helpful glossary for these conversations. This episode marks the beginning of a series of conversations with artists for our next exhibition, Radial Survey Volume 2. Radial Survey is a biennial that was created in 2019 to fill a gap in the cultural landscape of our region. We needed to share the work of the very best photographers in our region, which we decided to define as that wide and rich space between the art capitals of New York City and Chicago, which has Pittsburgh at its center. The result is Radial Survey, a biennial exhibition of the preeminent, emerging, and mid-career photo-based artists working within 300 miles of Pittsburgh in any direction. Our goal is to highlight this work, support these artists from places that are sometimes overlooked in the national photography conversation. Our first conversation in this series is with Raymond Thompson Jr., a photographer and multimedia artist based in Morgantown, West Virginia. Raymond had a long and accomplished career as a photojournalist before he pursued a Master's of Fine Arts at West Virginia University. We got to talk about how his background in a just the facts style of photography has influenced his current practice, which takes a huge amount of historical research and combines it with personal, imaginative narratives that are thoughtful, powerful, and completely beautiful. I hope you enjoy this studio visit with Raymond Thompson Jr.
Raymond Thompson Jr., welcome to Studio Visits with Silver Eye.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm really excited to kind of dig into this work because I know we've been having some conversations really for almost a year now about various aspects of the work, and we're really excited to feature some of these pictures we'll discuss in our biannual survey, Radial Survey. Why don't we just kick things off and I'll ask you about the work that will be featured in the November show at Silver Eye. It's from a series called Appalachian Ghosts, and it's a series of pictures called The Dust. And it takes its inspiration from the Hawk's Nest mining disaster in West Virginia. First of all, what is the Hawk's Nest tunnel mine, and how did you become interested in it? How did you learn about it?
Yes, so Hawk's Nest Tunnel disaster is what some folks call like one of the worst industrial disasters in United States history. So in the 1930s, a tunnel was built on the New River to divert the New River. And in that process of building that tunnel, they built a 3.5-mile tunnel through rock. In that process of drilling, the workers basically came across a large section of silica rock. And because they're using improper drilling techniques, they kicked up a lot of dust. There were about 3,000 workers working at the time. Not all of them, of course, are working underground, but because of these improper drilling techniques, it's believed that a great many of them who were working underground contracted silicosis, and it's estimated roughly a little under 800 of them passed away. But the problem with this story is that we don't know what happened. A lot of the workers were migrant workers, and they came from all over the region, and they dispersed. The company basically sort of wiped the landscape clean of any memory of what happened at Hawk's Nest, which is also reflected today. If you go to the space, there's very little marking what happened.
You're not from this part of the world. You're not from West Virginia. How did you, and I'm from much closer to this part of the world, but I had never heard of this disaster before. How did you find out about it, and what sort of captivated your interest?
Well, honestly, it was a book. It was Merrill Rukeyser's Book of the Dead, and specifically an essay written by Catherine Venerable Moore about Hawk's Nest Tunnel disaster and this book of poetry written by Merrill Rukeyser. I remember getting a copy of the book, and I was reading this essay. It's like, this is so fascinating. This happened in Reno, 2 hours from here. What is this? And this is when I first got to West Virginia. And I was like, wow, this is a super interesting story. I'd like to know more. I want to go to this space at some point. But I mean, it wasn't enough for me to kind of jump off and go down there. It wasn't until, because of this book was, at the time I was working for West Virginia University, and that book, the Merrill Rukeyser's book was published by West Virginia University Press, that we went to go do a story. And I met Catherine down there, and she took us for a tour of the geography of Hawk's Nest, and being physically in location, going to the Hawk's Nest Workers Cemetery, going to just below the dam. You can pretty much walk it right up to the dam because of the way it's structured. People go there to fish and boulder. And it was such a powerful experience that's when I became hooked and wanted to figure out a way to sort of tell this story. But also, you know, at the time I was just entering art school, coming from a space of being a photojournalist and moving into a more art space. The problem I had was moving from photojournalism to art. The reason why I sort of made that move was because I couldn't tell stories of the past very easily. And this is, I thought, was an important story. When you go to the place, go to Hawksnest, there's no, you know, reference to what happened in the space really. And I wanted to sort of rectify that in some way. And I sort of needed to find creative outlets or creative ways to approach it.
That's so fascinating. I was thinking about that idea of, you know, your background as a photojournalist and being interested in the past, and photojournalism is so necessarily based in a present moment. But before I ask that question about how you decided to kind of create these photographs, I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about what you found so powerful about that experience of visiting the tunnel and the dam. Like, what hit you there?
Well, at the Hawksnest Workers Cemetery, it was the sheer, almost haphazardness of the space. Because you walk into that space, at the time, it was like summer. Clearly, like, this is a volunteer-run space, right? Someone's coming to cut the grass every so often. But at that time, it was overgrown. Like, you could barely see these crosses. The crosses are plywood, right? There's plywood crosses that someone put together. All around the cemetery, people have left little, like, there'll be like a penny on top of a cross, which is like an offering. People leave little toys here and there. So there's this ephemera, and the fact that some of these probably crosses were turned to the side, that it felt like a space that was recently created, even though like this history happened a long time ago. And there's a whole story behind just that space, you know, that, I mean, even the Borders' bodies were buried is the same place where they were originally buried. They had to widen Route 19, and they found those bodies and they moved them off to the side. That's a whole other longer story. But what really struck me was going beneath the dam at Hawksnest. You can park and walk about 3/4 of a mile all the way to beneath this dam. And if you ever, stand below a dam, first of all, there's a fear factor, right? Because it's just like there's a wall of water, and all these things have to do is open up, and then that whole area is going to be flooded, right? So it's kind of this awe, there's this sound, this roar, there's this mist kicking up. It's a really awesome structure. And even, I think they call it an area below the dam that dries, but there's this little island of rock, hard rock there. You can see, like, in this island, you can see remnants of like pieces of metal that have been, you know, left over from some construction, like drilled into the rock that got left there, right? Rusty. And you start to see all these things in the environment, and you start to think about this story. You know, back in 1930s, if you stand in that space, that whole entire mountain would have been active with cabins and people moving. And it's so amazing to me now that it's just gone. Like, and there's no reference. It's like industry came, did a thing, and we don't know what happened here at all. And that's specifically, you know, what really inspired me to get into the story. Plus, just simply the power of all being in that space struck me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's so interesting, right? Because there's the power of the kind of industrial space and this kind of great modern, you know, project of modernity. And then there's just like describing the cemetery, the sheer disposability of these men in their lives, and, you know, the way they were just used as kind of fodder, like thoughtlessly, for this great, you know, capital project, right?
Yeah, it's what's interesting is that the cemetery is a solid 20 miles from the dam.
Oh, wow.
Bodies had to be, when people died, company paid an undertaker to take these bodies away. And that happened all over the region. And particularly what the cemetery was, the thought or rumor is that the undertaker took those bodies, buried them in his own personal farm. Bodies were forgotten about, potentially piled over with corn, and then rediscovered when the state widened Route 19, and then reburied off the road. Is the story behind that.
Wow.
So again, another form of disposability. But even in the one photograph, the photograph of the Hawksnest Workers Cemetery, which is not on my website, but even in that one photograph, like that each one of those crosses represents 3 bodies. like that space as it looks in that photograph doesn't quite look like that anymore, because at some point 2 years ago, the state came in, cut a power line right away, through the middle of it. So it took away half the trees off the property. So it's just like half treed, half untreed. There's other ways in which this, continues to like pound on like erasure of space and erasure of these people.
Given all of that, and given your background, I'm specifically thinking about the photographs in the dust, which are a kind of a reenactment, maybe is a word that would apply. How did you think, going from that photojournalist background where you're photographing only the things that are happening in a kind of, objective as possible way, how did you decide how you were going to imagine these men's lives, and also this decision to kind of depict them kind of with this poison dust swirling around them?
As I was starting this project, I became really inspired from Christina DeMille's Afronauts book, and the way in which she sort of played with these like faux archival papers and sort of used those papers to sort of, recreate visuals about a kind of a Kenyan space program that we assume never happened. Not quite sure if those documents are real, but I became really fascinated with the idea that archival documents could inspire the creation of new images, especially images that we've never seen before. And specifically thinking about images of the archive and Black life, and how so much is missing from that archive visually of African American in life. And I really wanted to figure out a way to add to the archive. And I also knew from looking at what's available from Hawk's Nest, very, very little images of African Americans working in this space. I was more struck by the few videos online that are available, how primarily it's white folks doing the talking for a disaster that 2/3 of the victims were African American. And I wanted to sort of not rectify it, but I wanted to add to the archive. Like this is not a true archive in that sense, but it's an archive in a sense that I wanted to add to the visual story behind it. I wanted to know what it was like to be standing next to these men in this tunnel and look to my left or my right. And well, I imagine it was beautiful, with the lights being in there and the dust kicking up, and it's just like, you can barely see, but you can see parts of bodies moving through this dust, and you're working. And the inspiration for that series was literally just like darkness, this dust, these tools, these men's working.
I think that like that idea of like the headlamp light source and being in this dark tunnel and having this swirling dust and just these, men who are kind of ordinary workers, right? But they're also become something kind of celestial about the images, right? Like I one image in particular that I love is just the dust kind of refracting in the light, and the lens flare and the focus kind of becomes like galaxies or something like that. And I thought that was such a beautiful metaphor. I'm not sure for what exactly.
I mean, for me, it's and I'm still like thinking on this, so my thoughts aren't fully formed about thinking about Afrofuturism and this idea, like, Afrofuturism is always thinking about this idea that projects Blackness into the future. But I feel like when you do the same thing, you project to the past. There's also this element of the surreal, of the magical, of this celestial going backwards. And in some ways, like, I'm still trying to figure out how to touch on those things. Like, it's like a work in progress, but it's a thing that interests me.
So I think along those lines of, I wanted to ask a little bit about your research process and the archival material that is, I mean, to me, kind of astonishing, some of these images that you found. Once you became interested, how did you decide to tackle researching?
Yeah, it became a process. Like, half of it is happenstance. Like I was reading my archivist book. I met Catherine. I went to visit these spaces. I went and spent time down in the archive itself, at the West Virginia State Archive. And, they have, you go in there, you can request a box of Hawk's Nest pictures. It's about 200-ish images, and literally going through each and every picture and looking at them and seeing what was in them, and, ascribing some images from there. What struck me about that box was like, and I really realized it, that that archive is all about documenting an industrial process. So there's very few images of people, but the few images of the people there's like 2 solid images of portraits that I was really into and really excited about. And just, once I got those and, those hung on my studio wall for 6 months before I did anything with them, I began to each one kind of presented a challenge, right? I was really fascinated by specifically in the image of the portrait image in which you see all these workers working in the tunnel cut, just standing there for this portrait. And I was really fascinated by their body language. Like everyone's standing in there, and there's a lot of dignity and pride in which those men are standing in there. But in the very nature of this image and what it was made and who it was made for, I mean, you can clearly see who was important in the image by they're centered and they're brighter. And people who weren't working at all, you can see them off to the side. And if you even further out to the side, you see you see people who have been dodged away, burnt away in some sort of darkroom practice, right? But if you, drill into those figures, there's so much dignity and there's so much personality within them. And this is all we have to know who was working in this tunnel. But again, because if you think about this image, out of 200 pictures, there's only one like this, maybe two. And literally we know nothing about what happened to these men. And I just wanting to pull them out of the space. And another image, when you think about the way in which some images in which figures have been completely removed, I think I found one image in which it looks like, most likely some way either chemically removed or scratched off from a negative. One image, for example, in which, they're outside working, the men are clearly working, but they're completely blacked out. But in the same image, you see someone who's probably a manager or boss standing, posing for the camera, who's completely in focus, who's also on that same plane, which is super fascinating to me. So those particular figures became an inspiration for the my erase trip that I made for the project as well. Yeah, it's pretty, material itself is fascinating and trying to understand what's going on, but we'll never know, right? Because all the negatives have been destroyed. The originals are gone. The company that had them destroyed them. The State Archive has copies, but the negatives I believe were nitrate negatives, so they were highly flammable and they were destroyed.
I mean, it's just so fascinating and kind of upsetting and almost bizarre, the extent to which the workers are burned, the darkroom technique of burned out of the image. I remember when you first showed me these images, I assumed they were your interventions into the image because I just couldn't figure out how it could have happened. But
yeah.
And eventually you did sort of decide to make further interventions into these found photos, kind of with a zooming and imposing text over it.
Yeah.
In the series, the sort of sub-series that you call Erased.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, so also in looking for archive stuff, at Western University History Art and Archive Center, they have Holt's, the Senator Holt's papers. Holt, the senator from West Virginia, held a hearing about Hawks Nest in 1935-ish. And in that hearing, workers were sending in letters to ask for pleading for help. But all those letters, you can go and look at them, the actual real letters at the archive. And specifically, I found one letter. A few of the letters were actually describing conditions as what it was like to be in a tunnel. And I thought, so I combined the sections of the letter which are describing, what it was like to be in that space and how desperate it was, with the images, these textural blobs that have been left within the archive images. And I just wanted to sort of combine the two and sort of to, we have this erase bit here purposely removed from the image, but then we have this, this is actually what it was like to be in the space.
How did it feel on a personal level to connect with these men? Did you feel like you got somewhere with your imagining and your projecting? Where did that take you personally?
It is, it's funny. It's a question you get asked in grad school all the time. What is your direct connection to this story in the space? I'm not from West Virginia, but for me, it was in the quest to try to understand, specifically around this time, 1930s, 1920s, 1910, Black life in America, because I don't have a great understanding of my own family history during that time. There's almost a historic wall of memory that stops in the 1920s. And I feel I really wanted to reach back and wanted to understand these stories. I wanted to see them and feel them. A lot of my work has been about trying to connect to the landscape of this place. And through doing stories like this and other stories that I've worked on, or stuff that interests me, is all about reconnecting to the mythical landscape of America.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, because I was just finding from my experience, not being from West Virginia and not being a Black person, finding them very powerful just as, adding an embodiment and adding a kind of a voice and adding, something like handwriting to me is so personal. And so, just like reminds me of the body, and the way you frame the images of the men working, like doing these physical acts of labor, feels very palpable, right? Like, so I don't know. I mean, I think when I saw the work, that just struck me right away.
Yeah.
But even not knowing what exactly was being reconstructed, I could feel it being reconstructed. So the next thing I wanted to ask you about, and I think a good note to transition is, for your next project, it sounds like you got more interested in your own family's history, or trying to learn as much as you could about your own family's history. And there was some major shifts in media, and you stopped using paper and you started using plants. Tell me about your next project and working with your own family's history and how you got interested in that.
Right after, working on Hawk's Nest, I wanted to, oftentimes when I talked about Hawk's Nest, I would talk about my connection to the story was this interest in the erasure of African American history. And because there is this own erasure within my own family life. And so I wanted to try to move to address that erasure specifically. At the time, I really only had an idea about my grandfather's life specifically. I was born in North Carolina, and that was all I knew. And so I wanted to sort of figure out what was going on with that. I began interviewing family members and getting little bits of story and finding these really interesting myths. Not necessarily myths, but everyone, there's like this oral history that's never been written down, and each person's version is different. So I don't know what's true. So it almost moves into the mythical at some point. But also at the same time, the COVID has struck and pretty much, grounded me to my house for a year. And I thought that maybe I'll start with the visual archive of North Carolina in the 1930s, 1920s. And of course, my family doesn't have any photographs that I know of. So the only reference I could really find was by digging into the FSA archive and of specifically workers or people working at the land in North Carolina. So I began to use those as references for my visual understanding, at least what did it look like during that time, right? That's like the first step in the process. And from my interviews with my family, I knew that, the part of North Carolina where my grandfather was from, and they believed that he would have grown tobacco and cotton as a young boy in the 1920s, 1930s. So I just was like, tobacco, what is it like to grow tobacco? Like, I really need a leaf. Where can I get a tobacco leaf? And I started like looking, is there a tobacco field around here? Maybe I can go to the tobacco field. And then I was like, why don't you grow tobacco? I was like, and I found this dude who sold seedlings. He sent me 3, and I began growing tobacco on my front porch. And, it worked. I got 3 fully mature plants. And at this time, I still had no clue what I was going to do with those plants. I just wanted to have the leaf around so I can look at it and see and just experience what they look like, what they smell like.
Was it important that you kind of grew them yourself and didn't, buy a cured leaf or something?
I think so. I think I have like all these video of me doing it. Like I actually documented the process of me going out every day, watering, caring for this tobacco plant. So that became part of my practice of the many mediums in which I'm approaching, but not all of those experiments make it out to public. But, I documented myself growing this plant. So it was a whole me doing this every day, me talking to the plant, me wondering if the thing was going to survive. So that became part of the practice of like me just doing the thing, like trying to top the seeds off of the tobacco plant so the leaves will get bigger and fatter. So after I did that, I think I began, like, first time I took a leaf off and I just drew it down, and I began taking pieces of paper and just building collages on top of green leaf. And I believe at some point, I had seen Bing Dang's work before, chlorophyll printing, and it's like, that's cool. But then all of a sudden, thought, like, let's try that, right? And lo and behold, I was able to make some digital negatives and contact print these things in the sun, and they held up. And that's when I was like, oh, this idea of fusing, the visual FSA archive, which is one sort of mediated archive, which had a purpose, along with this very important tobacco leaf cash crop in American history. And it's like putting them on top of each other became like, that's how that became the fruition. It's just combining these two sources.
That's so fascinating on so many levels. And I guess, so many questions, but one of them, they're titled like Untitled after Marion Post Walcott or Untitled after Dorothea Lange.
Yeah.
And of course, like in North Carolina, in the FSA, it's largely, almost entirely, except for maybe one exception, white photographers photographing Black workers. Did it feel like you were reclaiming an archive, or
Yes.
did you feel like, because you also work as a journalist and a documentarian, did you feel like you were in conversation with, like, what was, as I'm thinking about so much of the legacy of people like Sherry Levine and, the kind of pictures generation, but of course that is, like, the picture generation is so unacknowledging of kind of those, the racial component of authorship.
To me, it was ironic that I was trying to understand a piece of my own history or history adjacent in the area through the lens of specifically white photographers, but a white made photographic archive that was created to sort of render the Great Depression as a white tragedy. And there's Black people in it. And I just this is what I'm using to understand a bit of my own history. And there's an irony to that I found. And I wanted to directly reference whose images I was using because of Sherry Levine. I wanted this is Dorothea's Lange work. This is Marion Post Walcott work. This is what I mean. There's just, I wanted to pull them into the conversation and be like, yes, I am appropriating your image to make this statement by putting these on this sleeve. As much as their image was, they're beautiful documentary images, but they're also, in service to capitalism, in service to America, as much as the tobacco leaf is in service to all those same goals.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know if this is kind of extending it too far, but I was thinking about the silica work and the poison, the harm that the silica does cause. But I also began thinking about tobacco as a poisonous chemical that's caused so much harm, especially in the service of capitalism, especially the communities of color.
Yeah, there's so many ways into that, right? There's from one angle, from the, using tobacco and combining all the chemicals to it, and cigarettes becomes a kind of sort of poison. But recently someone sort of blew my mind, but, in different cultures, this is also medicine, right? And it has completely different connotations. So totally.
I was also thinking about the photographs, right? Because you are using these FSA photographs. There's such an iconic style to them, that is kind of has this kind of valorous kind of element to it. And it is, they are essentially propaganda photos.
They are.
How do you find yourself relating to that style of photography in this context?
Oh, I kind of had a crisis moment. While probably after I finished the series, I began to realize why are you using because I was working with these images and they're very much heroific. Everyone's working, everyone's in the field. It's almost like I was doubling down on tropes of Black life as worker. And I just really began to struggle with that. Even within my Huxness work, again, I was recreating these iconic images of Black men as worker. Then I come to this project and I'm sort of recreating images of Black people as worker or agricultural things. It could have just been like MFA grad school crisis, which hopefully will pass. But I really began to challenge my mind. Why are you recreating these images? They become like monuments or something, and it's something that I think a lot about. And, a lot of the stuff I've been reading recently and trying to figure out how to move from the space of loud resistance and we're workers and we're out there to a quieter space of trying to figure out how to make images of Black life that exists in a not so, it isn't all about resistance. There's also some quietness to just simply being in a quotidian of sorts.
That's so interesting. I have so many thoughts about it. Because in many ways, I think of the working not being the problem, right? Working is a wonderful, life affirming thing in many ways, being exploited as a worker.
Yeah.
being poisoned as a worker, being murdered as a worker is the problem.
Mhm.
But of course, there's so much more to life than work. And how do you share the breadth of that? I think is probably a life's work kind of question.
Yeah, it is.
Looking at this moment in history, and specifically thinking about Black life in the 1930s, has that changed how you think about life or Black life today?
I'm not sure. I've like most recently, I finally got to go down to North Carolina to do like a scouting trip to see some things. And the more I learn, the more complex everything gets. And
Mm-hmm.
compare everything. I'm finding some really interesting things, but I'm also finding that I know nothing. I'm finding that I found a family cemetery down in North Carolina. It's a group cemetery, I think, owned by one particular family, but the graves are all in there in a very hierarchical way. And like, so what's the relationship for all these families? This opened up a whole nother web, and I found like this, I actually was able to trace back my pretty much, I think, to the end that I can trace through the records, like to a John Kennedy, or at least was thought to be born in 1830s. And I'm like, well,
1830, yeah.
yeah, so that stops, I mean, it just kind of just stops in that point, but it answers so many questions in space. Like what I begin to do, I mean, even for that, I'm like, I'm just like, I'm gonna lay claim to Eastern North Carolina. Like that's just a space that I want to be working in. And I think when I think about now and this time and everything that's going on, is like, I just like, all I really want to do is to sort of like, just to build a foundation, whether that is in actual fact and history or in the mythology, in which like someone like my son can stand on and understand his connection to the landscape, his connection to this place. And I think that's the most important thing that I feel like I can do now, what I can offer. Like I thought about all the things that were happening during George Floyd protests, right? I think I went out and shot one, right? But it was like I don't need to do this work, and a lot of people are doing this work. And I think the work I was already on, the path I was already on, to try to understand its connections to the American landscape and all the messy ways in which they kind of squish together. I think that's the most important thing that I can be doing. So I pretty much just switch back to just doing the work I was doing, because I'm just trying to find those connections to the land and landscape here. And I feel that's important for agency and understanding yourself, so you can move into the future.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. And I just want to say, Raymond Thompson Jr., thank you so much for sharing this work with us.
Thank you.